All right, so this is the first chapter of Texas government, and we're going to start off by talking about kind of some of the nuances of our Texas government. In order to really understand Texas government, probably say that term 6,000 times, we kind of have to start with the history. Most political science classes or history classes or sociology classes tend to start off with the history and then kind of work their way forward. Well, one of the things we cover, at least in the book, is the idea of how Texas falls under Six Flags or fell under Six Flags. You may have heard that term before, used in other contexts. Probably won't get into that, but what is important about that is to understand how these kind of Six Flags refer to Texas itself. In the very beginning, we're talking about like way back in the day, Spain was one of the first countries to actually make its inroads into the Texas area. Granted, there were people already here, the Native Americans, but the first Europeans that came over were the Spanish. And they set up their systems and tried to get things going. I mean, mainly what they were trying to do, if you kind of understand the mentality of what was going on back then, is they saw this as a new land where there was gold and all sorts of things that they could exploit. They got here. Coronado found out that, or at least told them that all these riches were not here that they dreamed were there. I mean, they looked for them. They looked everywhere for them, but they couldn't find it. Then finally kind of gave up, and there were already forts and stuff that they'd actually set up, but basically they realized there was no huge benefit to Spain being in the New World. So they kind of like let it go and kind of stayed away from it. So for about another 150, 160 years until they came back again. But in that meantime, the French took over, or the French visited, if you want to call it that. The French saw kind of the same things of like, the exploitation of the land, but they were also very interested in expanding their empire, if you want to refer to it as that. And so they came into the lands and they built different places and tried to make a go for it. Most of the time, they didn't succeed because they didn't really bring the resources that they actually needed. And so kind of like an army that goes into war without actually any ability to refresh its military, they had the same problems because they couldn't refresh the cities that they built. And so basically they just kind of floundered and kind of died. So then the Spanish came back. This time they were more on expansionist principles rather than just the idea of looking for gold, while they were still kind of trying to do that. And so they kind of took over, and that became kind of the way things were for a while. So this went on for a while. The Spanish ruled this particular area of the land until the president who was in charge at the time, which President Santa Anna, who decided that he wanted to become dictator. And so we ended up with a war, ended up being the forces between the Texans that were there and Mexico that was basically trying to take over. When that finally ended, we ended up with Mexico not actually succeeding, and we ended up with the Republic of Texas. The Republic of Texas lasted for a little while and then saw they weren't going to actually make it financially. They tried, but basically they just didn't have the resources to actually make it happen. They had lots of land. That was basically the one thing they could offer, but they didn't have like anything to back up that particular land. So they started looking at this new kind of empire that was in the area and thinking we should become part of them. And this new empire happened to be the United States. And so they applied to become citizens of the United States, to become one of their states. The problem with it at that time was the United States didn't want to actually add another state at that time, because in order to add a new state during this period of time, you had to actually add two states. One was a slave state and one was a non-slave state. Is the only way you could actually get any new states into the republic. And so because Texas was basically a slave state, they needed a non-slave state, and there was none available, at least for quite a deal of time. So basically they couldn't become a state for a while, but became a property of the United States until finally they did become a state which was basically about 10 or 12 years before the actual Civil War. And so they declared independence and became the part of the Confederacy. And then the Confederacy is, hopefully, lost. Then when the Confederacy was over, basically they became part of the United States again. So a lot of the problem that Texas had kind of right from the very start was the fact that it became a slave state. It was part of the South. And in order to survive, it basically needed it was relying on a slave economy. And then when slavery was basically over because of the war, they suffered kind of going forward because they didn't have that to fall back on. And then the Reconstruction period, if you know anything about it, it was pretty hard on many of the states that were brought back into the Republic. And so they kind of suffered for quite a while, and until basically that was all over. One of the advantages that Texas has going for it is basically we have lots of land. And so in the very beginning of Texas's history within the United States, the one thing they really had to offer was land. So they would offer all sorts of grants to people who would come here. So they would give them, certain acres of land in order to migrate to Texas, and that would get your population going. The other advantage they had, which was something that didn't really actually come to be as a real entity of importance until about 1901 or so, was oil. We had tons of oil. We discovered this, and then suddenly there was oil all over the place. And so that basically helped build the economy. But the problem with oil, if you understand it and kind of have followed it like all over the world, is it can make an area very wealthy, but when oil is not doing very well in the market, it can actually devastate that same economy at the same time. And so that would happen to Texas quite a bit. It would actually start doing really, really well, and then basically set up all sorts of recessions and cause all sorts of problems kind of going forward. Which sort of brings us to the government of Texas itself, or at least the governmental structures and kind of the process of politics as it exists in the Texas system. Since the very beginning, as you can kind of remember from just our short little conversation just a second ago, we've been basically a slave state. So basically, we've been basically a southern state, which historically started off democratic until a lot of the restructuralism and the changes in our society basically kind of flipped around in the 1960s to where if you were a Democrat, you became a Republican. And that can get a little confusing, but the best way to really understand it for Texas is consider the fact that Texas has generally always been conservative. So whatever party kind of falls into the conservative mindset, that's usually the party that the majority of Texans kind of fall behind or fall into. And so that's kind of how it's actually worked before. So one of the problems not one of the problems, I keep saying problems. One of the interesting facts about Texas is as a southern state, it has a tendency to be, I don't want to say anti-government, but more challenging towards government. So whenever you have like a national or a state issue, a southern state or a historically Democratic, but now Republican state is going to challenge the structure of national government, whereas the opposite would actually be for federal government and against states' rights, or more for one rather than the other, if that makes any sense. So I want to get into a few nuances that are going to be really important when you kind of consider all the different things about studying Texas. Whenever you study a state government, there's all sorts of things that are going to be different from one state to another, but there's a bunch of things that are very similar, such as, for one, we rely on a constitution. Our country relies on a constitution, so does our state, which means, if you think about it, you shouldn't have leaders actually doing things that are against the rules that have been set forward by the legislators that made the rules for them. And so whenever that happens, that's when you start to see the court system get involved, because you're not supposed to be doing things you're not supposed to be doing, if that makes sense. So that's kind of one of the important things. But one of the other factors that's really important to understand about Texas specifically is just the ideal and the mindset of the, I want to say the average Texan, but everyone is different. But it's this mindset that has kind of been made over the years on what an actual Texan is. And the idea is Texans tend to be more independent. And as a result, you'll find our politics and our entire system of government is more based on the idea of individualism, to where we don't rely on federal government. So our state government tends to consider itself not superior to federal government, but they're going to be watching out for themselves at the same time that they would actually be looking and doing the things that the federal government requires. So the state will do as much as it actually can, as long as it doesn't go against the actual federal constitutional rules. So that's kind of how a system like ours works. Yeah, and so that's kind of important to kind of think of that in the background. The other thing is, and I have mentioned this earlier, is we tend to share the same culture of most of the southern states. Most of the southern states were brought up as democratic states. They're not democratic now because there was a change in the 1960s after the civil rights movement, where the democratic states actually became Republican states. So we tend to be more on the same mindset of that. It doesn't mean we agree with everything they agree with, but at the same time, you'll find a lot of the policies and the systems that they put into place will be very much, more broad ranged in that particular area than it would if we were comparing things with, like, a state like Maine or, New Hampshire or something to that effect, or California for that matter. Which also brings up population, because one of the things that is benefited and probably been kind of a bit of an anvil to Texas as well is population. We've been getting more and more people, and these people, the people who are coming here, are coming from all sorts of diverse states and sometimes from out of other countries. But our main influx of people is coming from California, which kind of makes sense if you think about it, because prices in California for housing and pretty much everything else have skyrocketed, while the ability to get specific jobs has become more difficult, such as you need higher and higher levels of skills in order to get jobs, and there's not enough people to actually replace that. So people are leaving California and trying to find other places, and Texas has always been looked at as a positive place to go because our standard of living is a little bit lower. It's not exceptionally lower, which is why they're not choosing other places that are like way lower than what Texas would be. But it's going to make things easier for somebody coming from living in a much higher level of income, to an area where they can't afford California anymore. So they come to Texas, which makes a little bit more sense, which is why there's huge migration into areas like Austin, which is more of an industrial, technological area of Texas. And so you're going to find the larger cities are going to be bringing in more and more people. So that's kind of important to keep in mind. But also with population is to understand how the population in Texas is changing as well, because we're not just getting more people in, we're also getting a much higher level, much higher numbers of different demographics of individuals. So the Hispanic population has increased quite a bit in Texas, and that's continuing to go up to where the Hispanic population is now over 50%, which is going to continue to grow as you continue on, which means that a lot of politics are going to be geared to focus more on issues that would be important to those demographic communities than they probably normally would have in the past. So the last thing I want to talk about is some of the other factors that affect Texas when you think about it. One is there's a very strong religious value system built into the state. There's a number of very popular religions that are very important, especially in the political atmosphere as well. And so the book covers all the different ones that are of higher numbers, like there's evangelicals and the Catholic population, which makes sense, again, if you look back at the demographics as to why these numbers would actually exist. And the other thing that kind of leads towards the idea that the mindset of the average Texan is a lot more traditional rather than like progressive politics that you would kind of expect from, like, you know, a state like California or the West Coast or even the East Coast states. So keep that in the back of your mind when you're actually studying a lot of this information, because it's very important to understand why some of the decisions get made as to why the different policies get built up in Texas itself. And so that's all I really want to cover for the very beginning. The book covers quite a bit. The PowerPoints cover an extensive amount of information. So make sure you're studying that information to kind of keep up on where you need to be. We'll get much more into the nitty gritty as we kind of go through the rest of the chapter, or the rest of the course. But I wanted to get just like a basic kind of overview as we start at the very beginning to kind of understand why we got where we are. I mean, remember, we are who we are today because history got us here. And you have to kind of you have to understand the history that happened before us to understand why we are the way we are today. We didn't just like spontaneously become this way. And all of the things that have happened in the past have built us to where we are. But the things that are happening today will be the history that will lead us to the way things are in the future. So as long as you're following and you've got your eye on these things and you don't guess and kind of hope you can kind of figure things out just on, you know, anecdotal evidence and hoping that you can figure things out on how you think personally, that's how you'll understand how politics are, is to understand how the larger numbers of doing things and why they're doing things. And that can help you lead to where we're actually at today.